Okay, welcome back to another video in the Learn to Code playlist, and in this video we are going to be getting a little bit more into the syntax. And at the end of the video we should be able to write some decent code, because we're going to be introducing a few concepts here. Now some of those things will be conditionals and loops. And if we start to look at conditionals, there's two things we want to focus on. Those will be the relational and the logical operators. Now the relational operators you can think of as your less than, greater than, less or equal to, greater equal to, not equal to. The not equal to is right here at the end with this exclamation point, and then the logical operators are going to be your ands, your ors. Again, we have that exclamation point to symbolize the not. And from the logic course, you can kind of think of these logical operators similar to logic gates. And we can represent something like true being a 1 and false being a 0. Now it's worth noting any non-zero int or integer that we define, that's going to be true. So a little bit unconventional if this is the first time seeing this, but just a good thing to note. Now, from this, we're also going to introduce another very important part of writing any kind of code, and that's going to be the introduction of these if-else, and else-if statements. So we can have something called an if statement, where we have if and then some conditional thing. We're just going to call it something for now. But if that condition is met, then we have some code that we can interject, and the code will execute. Now, of course, here we only have one option, which is if something. So that pushes us to have the if-else statement. So again, we have if, some condition, and then some code that happens. But then we also have an else, and the else, you can see, isn't really dependent on any condition. It will just kind of default. Now maybe this still isn't good enough and you have multiple conditions that you have to account for, so then you can have the else if. So we can have something like our original if statement, some condition, then we can have else if something else, which is our secondary condition. You can have some other things happening. And then at the end of this, you could always, again, have another else statement. Now you are not just limited to one else if here. You could stack several of these, as many as you need up. Although if you have a lot of conditions, it may be useful to consider the switch case. So if we look at the switch case, again, we have some condition, something going on. And based off of something, we would define cases. So we could have something like case X, case Y, and then we would have a default. Now you'll notice in these cases, we have some code. But then we've also signified this break and then the semicolon. So that's new for us. And what this break will do is it will break out of this switch case, or we can actually break out of loops, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So now that we've looked at how to use these conditional statements, let's consider making a program. Now our program is going to be based off of a utopian government that's going to decide if you are allowed to sleep at 8 p.m. and it's going to be based off of your age and energy. A little bit odd of an example, but sometimes you got to make things interesting. Now, based off of the premise that we're going with here, we need to define some outcomes. And there's going to be 4 outcomes. There's going to be the case of no and no for old and tired, no yes, yes no, and yes yes. And you can think of this as our binary truth table. But we have to really think about what these outcomes are going to do. So we know that this old and tired option, those are going to be inputs. And for this basic example, that's going to correspond to some output. So if we examine our conditions, if you are not old and you are not tired, you have to work. If you're not old but you are tired, our utopian government says, well, you still have to work. If you are old, but you're not tired, well, it shows that you're honest, and we're going to let you rest. And if you're old and tired, well, you might not be useful to your government, your utopian style government here, and maybe something else happens. So if we open Visual Studio here, and from the previous video, we know a little bit about strings, so we're going to define two strings, and they're just going to correspond to the question of being old and the question of being tired. So upon the main starting, after we define those strings, we're just going to output a message to the citizen that's using the terminal. And then we are going to output just the question, are you old, yes or no? And now we're going to be using that input command. And this is going to allow you to type into the terminal, and whatever you type in after you hit enter, that's going to be stored as the string, are you old? Now we're going to do the same thing for the question, are you tired? Except whatever you enter is going to be stored in this string now. So now we can get into our cases. Now we have our first case where you are not old and not tired, and we have our output go to work. And the last case, you're old and you're tired. And perhaps your government decides to repurpose you. Maybe as a tree. And we actually need to consider one more possibility for our strings from the input. And that's going to be if someone didn't follow the yes or no format. So we're going to have one more else statement here. Now we can test this out by running the file. So you can see here, we have welcome citizen. It's only 8 p.m. and you want to rest. Are you old? Well, let's say you're not old. I'm going to ask if you're tired. Are you tired? No. Okay, go to work. So if we go back to the whiteboard, we want to consider something. And let's consider if we had a line of people. Some are old, some are not. You can see that everyone is very happy in this utopian society. And let's say our terminal is this nice device here. And we have our line of people that talk to the terminal, and the terminal decides what happens. So if the utopian government does not trust its citizens and wants this terminal to run automatically, we need to figure out a way to get that code to run in a loop. So that brings us into our loops. And there's two kinds of loops we can have. We can have an entry controlled loop, or we can have an exit controlled loop. So for the entry controlled loops, you'll commonly see something like a for loop or a while loop. So with the for loop, you'll have an initialization, you'll have some condition, and you'll have some updation, and then you'll have whatever's happening inside your loop here. Now this might be a little bit confusing, so if we consider the while loop instead, we simply have while, some condition, we follow whatever code is in the brackets. And then for our exit control loop, you might see something like a do while loop. Now in this case, to keep things simple, we're going to consider the while loop. So if we go back to Visual Studio, we can clear the terminal just to have a little bit more space. So what we can do to implement the while loop is inside the main, we're going to have int, and this is going to be machine on. That's going to be machine on, and we're going to say that's equal to true. So after we define machine on as being true, we're simply going to say while machine on is true. And then we're going to throw everything inside that we printed before. We're going to throw that inside the while loop. So you can see the closing bracket is right here. And you can see here, we get our original prompt. So we can do a few of our conditions. So you can see here, we asked if you're old and tired. Based off of the answers, you got the response that we wrote in before. And then it loops it and it asks the same thing. So we can try different combinations, and you can see what we get for all possible combinations. Now, one thing I don't like here is how immediately after you type in the inputs that it's asking, it loops you back to the beginning without any kind of delay. So what we can do here is stop the code, we can close the terminal, and we're going to include something that allows us to have some delay. And this allows us to use something called the sleep command. So here is our closing bracket for the while loop. So just above that, we're going to add sleep. And then in parentheses, we're going to put 2000. So whatever you put inside this sleep, that's going to be in milliseconds. So now you can see here, if we do this in real time, you can see that we get this delay. Now to end this video, there's something else we can do that's also of use. and that's going to be nested loops or nesting loops. And what this really means is that we can place loops or nest loops inside of other loops.